human beings ever see a group of things that they can classify or sort, they're going to do it. This helped us in the early days when we had to figure out which were poisonous berries and which were delicious. It also helped us when we look up to the stars to find patterns that we could give instruction by and navigate. All of that is helpful and well and good. Where it becomes problematic is when you start ascribing characteristics of those objects in the sky based on your personal belief system and not based on any facts or reality. Even very intelligent people who set up very detailed classification systems can be completely blind to how their biases and assumptions about how the world works affect their classifications. Like any variation, skin color was noted, but not with any negative connotations. People from warmer climates tended to have darker skin to protect them from UV radiation, and people from colder climates tended to have lighter skin to help them absorb vitamin D. Shared skin tone wasn't a positive, and it wasn't an alliance point. If you were being raided by the Vikings, the fact that you were white didn't really make a difference to the Vikings. If you were in the war between the Protestants and the Catholics, the fact that you all shared the same complexion didn't change your internal conflicts. For Europe, this calculation changed when they were able to discover sailing routes to the New World, giving them access to two continents full of people who had never been exposed to smallpox or other European diseases. 80 to 90% of the indigenous population died of disease, leaving them completely unable to defend themselves against European expansion. The indigenous people had learned how to cultivate some of the most nutrition dense food in the world, corn and potatoes, but unfortunately they had never had access to domesticated animals other than llamas. The Europeans now had access to these foods, plus they were able to bring in oxen and horses to plow fields, giving them a huge agricultural advantage. That is even before getting into the discoveries of silver and gold. It's hard to overstate how much the Columbian Exchange changed Europe and the entire world. Things we take as basic cultural cornerstones, like Italian tomato sauce, never existed before the Columbian Exchange because there were no tomatoes in Europe. Irish potatoes, Colombian coffee. The idea of a Native American on horseback was not a thing before the Columbian Exchange because there were no horses in the New World. All of this changed Europe's mindset from looking at things locally and regionally to suddenly looking at things globally and internationally. All of these new resources brought prosperity and wealth to these regions, and that wealth and prosperity was plugged into regional conflicts, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, where Portugal and Spain had been already engaged in ethnic cleansing of non Christians from the area. Laws had been passed in the 1450s allowing slavery of non Christians, plugging into the West African slave trade, and the Spanish Inquisition had begun even before the Columbus explorations. So the rationalization was ethnic, not racial. The argument was that they were going to the New World to teach the new indigenous people of Christianity and that they were able to enslave people from West Africa because they were in a holy war and these were prisoners of war. And enslaving prisoners of war was a normal practice at the time. Being able to claim military control over land is not the same as being able to produce with it. You need workers to mine and you need workers to work farms. And as the indigenous folk had been dying of New World diseases, those workers had to be imported from other places. Most of the cash crops of the New World were in tropical regions or subtropical regions, and although Europeans were not as susceptible to New World diseases as the indigenous people, they were very susceptible to diseases like malaria that grew in tropical regions. It was very difficult to get anyone from Europe to come voluntarily, and even those brought by indentured servitude generally did not survive the length of their indenture and would avoid coming altogether. West African slaves, of course, had no such choice, and being less susceptible to malaria made them quite valued by the plantation owners. Slavery at that point, including the West African slave trade, had been generally about a person, an individual who was enslaved, and would remain enslaved until they were able to buy their freedom or they died. It did not extend to anyone beyond that individual, it did not extend to their children. And the papal decree specifically said only non Christians could be enslaved. Missionaries had been coming converting indigenous people and slaves for years. So now you needed a new rationalization, a new reason to enslave not just a person, but all of their children. That's where whiteness came in. Since the earliest days, there had been laws that gave special privileges to Christians. Those laws slowly began to be changed where the word Christian was removed and the word white was replaced. The creation of whiteness solved the moral quandary. People who were not white could be enslaved, even if they were Christian, and so could their children because their children were also not white. There no longer had to be a religious reason or a moral reason. The distinctions were more blurry in earlier settled colonies, such as the Spanish and Portuguese, where because most of the Europeans who'd come over were male, and many of the slaves brought from Africa and other areas had been freed, you had a large population of indigenous and freed slaves that had intermarried with Europeans. The Spanish Empire adopted a complicated casta system that classified all of the Americans of various races and racial combinations, as well as where Spaniards themselves were born. By contrast, the English settlement of North America didn't begin until the 1600s and consisted mainly of colonies that included women and children as well as men, rather than just military expeditions entirely of men. The first documented arrival of slaves into the English colonies was in 1619 in Hampton Roads, Virginia. The English of that area had been trading with the West Indies and were well familiar with slavery, but this was the first time that slaves had been brought into the English colonies. In other colonies where fraternization and intermarriage was more frowned upon as a social sigma, in the colonies it appears there was actually legal consequences. In 1630, a gentleman by the name of Hugh Davis was, quote, soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and the shame of Christianity by defiling his body in lying with a Negro. Informal practices became formal law. In 1662, the law of the womb meant that any child born to a slave was also going to be a slave. In 1667, Christian baptism was not going to change the status of a slave, therefore, any Christian slaves would still be slaves. In 1669, it was even made that the killing of a slave is not a crime. And so, over more than a century, slowly you transition to conflicts in Europe being around ethnic differences and religious differences to creating a new concept of race that was not based in any religion or ethnicity, but in skin color primarily. Except, of course, that brings us to the Franklin quotes. Because it was never about skin color, it was always about rationalization. If you've decided the Irish are in your way, well, find a way that you can convince yourself that the Irish are actually black. Same for the Germans and the Italians. Whatever group is not part of your in group, just make them not white. The early Ku Klux Klan, for example, advocated that only native-born white Protestants were actually white, excluding Irish and Italian immigrants and going after them aggressively. However, much like the Germans before them, demographics dictated that only having white Anglo-Saxon Protestants designated as the in class was not going to work in a democracy. Therefore, they were allowed to become white as part of a voting bloc. Because unlike African Americans, these groups were allowed to vote, and when they won elections, those elections weren't overturned by armed men. Looking at demographic data, only about 10 to 13 million Americans are currently white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which means Ben Franklin didn't think most of you were white. History's awkward.